Hello and welcome everybody to our Homes for All webinar today. I'm Jonathan Lewis, one of the 3 programme managers here at the Nationwide Foundation. Colleagues may disagree, but I think I have one of the best jobs at the Foundation, funding projects that nurture innovation in the housing system, including our Homes for All, a vision for England's housing system, set up in partnership with the Church of England. I'm sure most of you know, but Homes for All sets out clear recommendations of our outcomes-led, truly long-term and transformational housing strategy that we actually published this time last year, I believe. And we can put a link in the chat to the website where you can access the report. I think most of you will know the Nationwide Foundation, but for anyone new with us today, we're an independent charitable foundation funded by the Nationwide Building Society. And we have a decent and affordable homes strategy that focuses on systemic change in our housing system. And for a while now, we've been calling for a national housing strategy, and it's been one of our key asks of government. So we're really pleased to learn that colleagues at MHCLG are currently working on a long-term housing strategy that will determine the direction of housing policy that we're hearing for the next, at least the next decade. So it's a really important time for housing policy development. And I know everybody on this webinar are really keen to work with the government and have been working with the government to ensure that the strategy will take a bold and long-term approach needed to address our housing crisis. And that's why I'd like to say a huge thank you to Isabel Barnes, who is the head of the cross-cutting housing strategy at MHCLG, and who is on the call with us on the webinar with us today, and will be giving us a brief update on her department's work in just a moment. And before then, I'd just like to say also a huge thank you to our other 2 speakers, Professor Alex Marsh from the University of Bristol and the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, who is one of the UK's leading academics on housing policy. And of course, David Orr, who has extensive experience across the housing sector, leading many organisations, commissions and inquiries. Even though I think you're meant to be retired, David, David continues to champion and lead great work across the housing sector. So Alex is going to give an overview of the initial findings of what works and what doesn't in international strategies. And I'd just like to say that this research is ongoing, but we are really keen to share the interim findings as soon as possible, given how fast the department is moving on its strategy development. So we will keep everyone updated after the webinar when it's published, and we will be sending everybody a copy. David is the chair of Homes for All Coalition and played a key role in developing our Homes for All vision. And David will be talking to us, talking through some highlights of the key findings from that collaborative work. And I don't think I need to remind everybody on this call about the scale of the housing crisis and the profound impacts it has on people's lives. Education, jobs, economy, community, the environment. We all understand the value of housing. So we'll get straight to hear from our speakers. But just to say that we will take questions after all of our speakers, but please do put any questions you may have in the chat as we go along, and I will try and get through as many of those as possible. So I shall pass over first to Isabel. Thank you, Isabel.
Great, thank you, and thanks everyone for having me, and thanks also to Alex, the Nationwide Foundation and the broader Homes for All team for all of their work and support in helping us build the evidence base around the strategy. I'm afraid that, as you might expect, I can't share many firm details here today on the strategy as it's still in development, but wanted to say a few words. And Jon has already said that we don't need to remind everyone on this call about the scale of the housing crisis, but I did want to just quickly touch on that and why it is that we are talking about a housing strategy, and that this is the housing crisis that the country has been facing is, of course, one which has been going on for decades, and the impact that it has on people's lives. The latest numbers on homelessness were released last week, and we have again hit record highs, nearly 165,000 children in temporary accommodation. We have 1.3 million households on the social housing waiting list. House prices are too unaffordable for too many, and too many people also living in homes that are unsafe from fire risk, and too many at risk of eviction for no fault of their own. I also wanted to say that it feels like a really exciting time to be working on housing, as ministers have been clear that they're determined to tackle the crisis head on, and start the process of putting things right. And this is a priority not just for the Deputy Prime Minister and the Housing Minister, but also for the Prime Minister and Chancellor. And you'll have seen how central building new homes is, and in particular new social and affordable homes is to the government's plan for change. Also how important the safety and quality of homes is, with the Deputy Prime Minister last week accepting all of the Grenfell inquiry's findings and taking action on all of the recommendations, as well as, of course, the security of homes, as you'll have seen in the Renters' Rights Bill. Now, addressing the housing crisis is obviously not going to be easy, and ministers have been clear that this requires a long-term view and working across government departments, and the government working also closely with all parts of the housing system to bring about the change that we need here. And a core part of that is having a long-term housing strategy, one that has a really clear vision and outcomes on what we want to achieve across the housing system, which is including supply, but also the affordability of homes and the quality of homes, to name just two. This strategy needs to be not just an MHCLG strategy, but a government strategy that includes all the departments that hold policies and interventions that impact housing, which is almost all departments, because housing is both impacted by other government policies, but also has a huge impact on other departments' outcomes, so educational outcomes, health outcomes, climate outcomes. And whilst housing sits under the growth mission, it impacts all of the missions in one way or another. The final thing I'll say is that our ministers have been very clear that the strategy needs to be developed with and informed by all of the expertise that we have working on housing outside of government too, which is why we've been working really closely with colleagues from different parts of the housing system to understand what they want and need from a housing strategy, which hopefully leads nicely into Alex's presentation on what we can learn from other strategies to make this successful, and David's presentation, all of the work on Homes for All, which worked with a coalition of partners from across the housing system. So I'm handing back to Jon now.
Brilliant. Thank you, Isabel. And it's really great to have you here today. And it sounds like, there's been lots of good work that's going on. It's great to hear that, this is a government strategy, and that kind of going across different areas, different departments across government, and the impact that has and the importance it has to have that collaboration work. So it's great to hear that. And I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say, we eagerly and await its publication. So no pressure, but looking forward to it. So now I'm pleased to introduce Professor Alex Marsh to give insights so far from his research. And after we've heard from Alex, we'll hear straight from David Orr. So over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Jon. Okay, thank you ever so much, and thanks to everybody for coming along today. So this is given the policy development timescale that in the external environment, we're working to quite a short timescale for this piece of research. I'm working with Hal Paulson, who many of you will be familiar with, who's currently at the University of New South Wales, used to be up at Edinburgh at Heriot Watt, and Ken Gibb, my colleague at University of Glasgow, the director of CASH. What we're doing is we are trying to gather evidence on housing strategy, where it exists, and perhaps why it doesn't exist where that isn't the case. And by housing strategy, we are talking about more than simply the portfolio of policies in operation at a particular point in time. This definition on my slide is one which was provided by the UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing a little while ago. I think captures quite succinctly what we're interested in. Housing strategies operate at a higher level than housing policy and programs, based on a vision, structural change required over time. It coordinates a wide range of laws, programs, policies, decisions to address housing needs that's taken together create a housing system. So I've emphasized 4 terms there, which I think points to what we're interested in discovering, something about the old goal-oriented nature of housing policy activity cross-nationally, something about the temporality. It's not just short-term measures, it's long-term. It's something about coordination. It's not just a collection of actions or inactions. It's that there's some sense that they are complementary or reinforcing, and that thinking about this is systemic. So what we've done, what the project is trying to do, is trying to review the literature on housing strategy, both the prescriptive literature, that is views on what should be done, and the descriptive literature, such as it is, that is what is being done. And I'll cut to the chase, and that isn't vast literature. One of the striking things about this project is precisely that this isn't a lens that's frequently applied to housing policy cross-nationally in the academic literature. So there's not a vast amount on the descriptive side. So then we've contacted experts to gather information on recent experiences across a wide range of OECD countries, and plus supplementing it with information from other countries as appropriate. And this is the list of countries we've put out sort of requests to. The reason they're in 2 bullet points is that the first group of countries I've heard back from, and I've got some information about, and the second group of countries we've got a request in, we've got promises of material. This is why it's work ongoing. So they're working to a deadline where I'm expecting imminently to get further material from some of the other countries. So the aim being to derive lessons from the material, drawing on this international experience. So that's the nature of the project. So we're asking colleagues, is there a strategy? If so, let's break it down and have an understanding of how that was developed and its content and your assessment of its value, and then the question of whether or not, and if not, then what's the state of play in terms of advocacy for a coalition? If there is for a strategy, why isn't there one? Is there likely to be one in the next 5 years? These sorts of questions. So I guess some key points to start with before we get into a little bit more detail. I mean, I think Isabel made the comment that it's not an easy proposition to develop a housing strategy. I would say, looking at comments from colleagues internationally, it's a challenging proposition. But those that have attempted this type of strategy could demonstrate several elements of what one might consider as required, or not necessarily the same in each case, but that nobody's cracked it entirely. So if you create an ideal type, I'll talk a bit through in a minute my current thinking on what the strategy process looks like. I would say that there's no country that is currently positioned as ticking all the boxes. They might well be ticking several of them. I mean, one of the things that comes out of reading the commentaries from other countries is thinking a little bit about the right way to a strategy, and that might well be contextual. It depends on where we are. So actually, is it the case that, if you like, the best route in a particular political context is a big bang reset reform? We're going to adopt a strategy, or is it something which is a little bit more incremental? So a strategy which maybe was a little bit partial initially, gradually, is the basis for building something a bit more wide-ranging. It's clear, looking at the way in which some countries' policy is developing, that the strategies acquire additional dimensions, additional functions, and then in some cases that's partly about political feasibility. A big bang wouldn't have worked on day one, but a strategy which addressed a particular slice of the housing system, if that can be put in place and start to demonstrate some benefit, then people are more willing to see it expand and start to address a broader range of issues. So there's something there about difference of context and how you get to a strategy. But in some cases, we would say it's not that there isn't some countries there isn't a national housing strategy or anything approximating it for different sorts of reasons. In some cases, it's not deemed to be a desirable type of approach. So in particularly heavily decentralized, obviously lots of countries are federal. Some of them are federal to the point where national coordination wouldn't be welcomed. Others are federal with an acceptance that a national strategy might be desirable as a complement to what's happening at state or regional level, but that at present the ability of the system to coordinate that is challenging. And I've got a comment there from our German correspondent. Germany is a political culture strongly driven by, because it's a large strategy, would require endless talks with potentially no outcomes. That's not just between central and local government, but between the other social partners and various other stakeholders. And to bring something together which would constitute a national strategy, which would pick up broad-based acceptance, was deemed to be beyond, if you like, something that the system could cope with just at the moment. Although academics there might also be arguing that it would be of value to join things up more effectively than they currently are. Okay, so some broad points there. So I think one of the things that we're trying to develop in the way this piece of research is going to be reported is to keep these three dimensions of strategy explicit and in play: politics, polity, and policy. So quite a lot of the commentary on housing policy or housing studies and its engagement with policy zooms in quite quickly on policy, the substance of policy, the balance between social renting, private renting, home ownership, the use of taxation versus direct provision, the role of regulation. So it gets quite quickly into the nuts and bolts of that, and quite often stands back from the broader conditions under which strategy is firstly likely to evolve and be created, but secondarily the conditions under which it's likely to be sustained over time. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is structure the reporting so it touches and keeps these three components in place. That is the politics of housing. If we ask, why isn't there a housing strategy in some countries? We had desirability and feasibility elsewhere, but priority, for example, is another component of that, which can play in different ways. Priority can mean it's not a hugely contentious topic if it's not high priority, so there can be collaboration without it being politically contentious, or it can mean nobody's putting the focus and energy on it, so therefore politics, unless as an issue it moves up the agenda, a strategy is not going to be forthcoming. But that notion of the politics of the situation, not just to get the process started, but to sustain it over the long term. And then the polity, so the institutional architecture, the rules of the game, the organizations involved in the process, the procedures, how do we deliver, not just implement not just the delivery of a strategy, but also the monitoring of the strategy, the oversight of the strategy, its revision, its continued currency as we go over time in a relatively turbulent and uncertain environment. These are questions about the institutional architecture to support the pursuit of the goals that have been agreed in the political stream. So I just want to take each of those dimensions and say a little bit about those in the rest of what I've got to say today. So in terms of how we're sort of setting that out, this is the current version of the sort of framing that we're using for our report. So we can think about the strategy process as a process of preparation, the process of design and implementation. And as you see there, I'm keeping each of those three components live, if you like, in each of those three phases. And I'm going to take each one of those in turn in a moment. But this diagram might suggest that this is a sort of linear process moving from preparation to design to implementation. But of course, that would be to simplify things too much. And in fact, we need to recognize that when we get to implementation, we've got processes of possibly experimentation, certainly learning, certainly reflexivity and feeding back to the design of our policy mix and policy framing. So therefore, we might add to that some sense that there's a need to recognize that delivery, monitoring leads to learning, which leads to adaptation at the level of the policy mix in the politics stream. So we need to recognize that these things iterate as we're going along, particularly when we're talking about strategies that are aiming for 10, 15, 20, 25 years into the future to address deep-rooted and long-standing problems. So to take each of these three phases in a little bit more detail. So in terms of preparation, building a coalition of support, so we can think about and clarifying and agreeing objectives and scope. So when we look across countries, we can think about some of the examples. For example, if we think about Canada, which got its national housing strategy. Prior to its national housing strategy, there was a survey of the public, getting, I think it was 6,500 responses. There was, I think if I remember correctly, it was 22 round tables that are run around the country to gather expert opinion on what was required. So it was a case of building an understanding, not just of the problem from different perspectives, but also support for the idea of a national strategy. So when that was legislated in 2017, it was the first strategy of its type. When we think about what's happening in Australia at the moment, where in Australia don't have a national strategy, they've got as a federal system, they've got state level housing policy, but there is a piece of legislation in Parliament at the moment called the National Housing and Homelessness Plan Bill, trying to move through the argument that there should be a national housing strategy. But the relevance here is that that's predicated on the idea of trying to identify consensus objectives which don't devolve to the lowest common denominator. So the idea of, I think one thing that comes through quite strongly is the idea that if you want a housing strategy to endure and not be partisan and if you like, policy pendulum switching backwards and forwards between governments, then some degree of background consensus about where we're trying to get to, what the objective is, what the scope should be, and putting that in place as a way of trying to move things forwards. We're seen by a number of commentators that we've been in touch with as fundamental. I mean, in the case of somewhere like in case of Spain, they've just announced a new sort of action plan trying to see that trying to position housing as the fifth pillar of the welfare state, which is a term which many of you in social policy in the UK will be familiar with, but is relatively novel initiative in Spain. But that is initiative of a particular government, and so that came into force a couple of months ago. So we can't talk about effectiveness, but we can, my colleague was also commenting on whether or not there's sufficient background, a sufficient coalition of support for that to be resilient across political cycles, because it's come in alignment with a particular political party without that necessarily having secured a broader consensus about where we're trying to get to, leaving aside how. So think about policy, think about institutions. Have we got the right sorts of organisation and sufficient capacity to deliver the strategy that we're envisaging? And then in the policy domain here, we're thinking about what's the nature of the analysis of the problem. Let's just think about the scale of the change required. And then I think one of the things that is relatively neglected in certainly in some of the commentary that I'm seeing is thinking about the rate of progress that's implied. If we got some measure of the scale of the problem, we've got some assessment of the sorts of changes that are needed, we can start to form a view on what a realistic sort of intermediate timescale for intermediate outputs, what time scale it would take to make significant inroads into problems, because that's partly about expectations management as much as anything. So as in keeping people on board with where we're going. Don't start with something too unrealistic in relation to where how fast we can solve the sorts of problems, particularly if they become sort of heavily embedded over a process of years or indeed potentially decades. And one of the things that comes through from some of the comments we've had already is the gaps can open up between these. So in some cases we could say, well, the analysis of the problem is pretty good and pretty comprehensive, and in others will say, well, actually it's rather partial and superficial. It's grappling with symptoms, not causes. But even in the former case, you say, well, the analysis was pretty good at the outset, but how that translated into a set of actions and a strategy, the strategy was not calibrated in the light of the scale of the problems identified. I mean, certainly that was a comment made about the Canadian strategy initially. It was focused particularly on social housing, but not on a scale that would necessarily address the problems. And one argument was, though, that the very existence of a strategy opens up the possibility for scaling up and changing function. And certainly since it came into force in 2017, the funding going along with it has nearly tripled. And so the commentary, it was responsive to initial feedback about scale and the need to change scale and scale up if it was really going to address the problem at the level that it had identified. Okay, so that's something about preparation. So we think a bit about thinking about design. So I've started there to talk about policies and policy mix. So one of the things we're interested in is to what extent our housing strategies or housing policy portfolios internationally considered to be coherent or comprehensive. And I think the answer to that is most of the strategies that we're familiar with most of them wouldn't claim to be comprehensive. They're focusing on either supply or homelessness or whatever else it might be. They're not, and the ones that do claim to be comprehensive fall relatively short on comprehensiveness in the view of some of our expert collaborators here. And in terms of coherence, one of the things that we remember from that definition of strategy at the beginning was about thinking about these things systemically, thinking about interconnections, thinking about the sort of complex causation and interaction between the various policies within a strategy. And I would summarize where we've got to in our evidence gathering as nobody that we've had contact with would claim that the government that they are or the policies and strategies they're familiar with is delivering something that's genuinely systemic in its thinking about not creating perverse incentives between initiatives or initiatives that are conflicting, for example. So even where there's a claim that the strategy is addressing across the range, it's not necessarily doing it in a way that's joining up. So I've got politics and policy here as well, and polity here. So sustaining a coalition. So one of the things that comes through, for example, from Scotland, if you talk about the Housing to 2040 process, the analysis of the problem at the beginning was seen to be quite good. The translation of that into a sort of portfolio of policies and roadmaps, the gap started to open up at it there in terms of the gap between a set of aspirations to, for example, stabilize the housing market and reduce volatility, and a set of actions that would deliver upon that, and they're maybe not so evident in the policy mix, but also over time, pressures on the budget, developments in other policy areas, some of the changes that have been made, the coalition of support that was initially behind the policy has maybe fractured somewhat. So attending to this, to sustaining that coalition of support seems to me to be a really important part of the story. If you like, you could think about a strategy as a relatively precarious achievement if these stakeholder concerns or support isn't attended to. So in terms of polity, we can think a bit about institutional reforms. So a number of these national housing strategies have been based on new pieces of legislation, or trying to, and the Australian example would be trying to enshrine in a particular definition of a housing objective in law, setting up a set of oversight mechanisms to an obligation on ministers to produce plans, an obligation on the delivery agencies to produce progress reports. Not saying that's what's necessary, but in that context, that's been judged to be the way to operationalize and implement that particular strategy. And here an attention to data. And one of the themes that comes through from the international commentary that we're receiving is we ask a question, how effective has your strategy been so far? And almost invariably, the commentary on that is we don't really know all that well, either because we're not collecting enough data or the right sort of data, or it's not arriving in a timely enough fashion for us to learn from that how things are operating. So the designing in sort of how can we learn, and in a more uncertain or changing external environment, understanding what works quickly, experimental governance, and then being able to adjust as appropriate, it seems to me to be crucial. So that data message comes through quite strongly from a number of our commentators that really it was difficult to pass judgment on how well it was doing. So that a whole set of institutional reforms, or at least institutional reflections that could lead to reform, seems to be a crucial part of the design process. And if we think about implementation, again, I keep sustaining the coalition there. In the original Homes for All report, for example, reference was made to small wins, not quick wins. But I think I think one thing that comes out clearly, even in countries where there isn't a national strategy, but there are elements of strategy or strategies to particular subdomains, Finland being a good example. You know, there's a very long history of quite an integrated homelessness strategy, but there isn't a national housing strategy, and a national housing strategy is judged to be politically extremely difficult. But that's the bigger picture. But the reason that the homelessness strategy is sustained, has been sustained up until relatively recently, or was being sustained up until relatively recently, was, you know, that it demonstrably was delivering. It was delivering sufficiently and delivering benefits that was sufficiently valued by the political system that it kept diverse stakeholders on board through 3 phases of planning. And actually, in the US, where there's no federal housing strategy, the one part of the system where there's a sort of consistency around sort of cross non-partisan support for action in housing is around homelessness housing first. And that again is because it seemed to be delivering something of value to you know, across the political spectrum. So that notion of sustaining a coalition of support because implementation is starting to deliver seems to be a really important part of the process, not just for keeping people on board, but also maybe instilling trust and confidence in stakeholders that this is an enterprise that might well need to be or could be expanded. So thinking a bit about the as I say, delivery. So some of these national strategies. So the recently passed Spanish piece of legislation is legislating for a new housing delivery agency to try and address the sort of affordable housing supply problem. Again, it's not saying that's what's needed for the UK, but it's a case of saying, well, look, we need to understand what we need in this context and existing institutions and how those institutions need to change in order to sort of catalyze the change that we're looking for. And in that case, the conclusion is we need a new housing delivery body to make things happen. And I think that the in the middle there, in terms of policy, a range of different sorts of coordinating or oversight and scrutiny arrangements being put in place. I mean, the most famous one of those being, I guess, the Canadian creation of the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate, and as a way of creating a body which sits outside government to scrutinise or hold government to account for delivering upon the commitments that it had made. But there's that idea of giving visibility to scrutiny, giving a chance to report on delivery, learn from delivery, think about whether things need to be modified, and pass it back up to the political stream for modification, including additional resources or tweaking objectives, etc. These creating a system where information can flow, that we're collaborating and puzzling together about how best to solve this set of problems, is something which you can piece together from bits of the jigsaw puzzle that different countries are trying to develop. So there's a whole set of questions there about keeping it on the radar, keeping things moving forwards, but also building, as I say, building confidence that this is a strategy that's delivering benefits, particularly as no doubt other competing pressures assert themselves on the political system. You know, this is something which is delivering value. Okay, so a couple of final slides before I conclude. So one of the things that we're also doing, I think, partly because the housing literature is not framing housing strategy perhaps in process terms or in terms of strategy development in quite the same way, as we're also exploring the literature in public admin, in public governance, which is looking across policy areas and saying, okay, what can we learn about what's in the current literature being referred to as sort of robust governance. So thinking about how we can design strategies that are robust in turbulent times. So that's about recognizing the need for stability and clarity on the one hand, but also the flexibility and agility to adapt as situations change. So this is a literature where robustness, which is seen as something more than simple resilience. So resilience is is the idea that if in the face of a shock you return to the status quo ante, get back to where you were, continue functioning in the face of challenges. I think the robust governance argument is one about saying, well, can we use challenges not just to build back the same, but I guess build back better, that idea. So some of it flows out of the sort of COVID conversation, but to generalizing that to say, well, what lessons can we learn? And another way of thinking about that is that in the crisis management literature, crisis management, natural disasters, earthquakes, is typically about acute crises, but also that governments typically face creeping crises, climate change being the most obvious one. But we could argue that the housing problem is one which has been accumulating over many years, and it has an acute manifestation, but it's not simply an acute crisis. And I guess the robustness idea is, how can you take advantage of addressing the acute crisis in ways that deals with the underlying creeping crisis? So there's important. So I think there's some lessons in there that we can draw and share that, as I say, don't necessarily originate with housing, but speak to the challenge that faces housing strategy. Similarly, there's some big recent reviews of the literature, systematic reviews of the literature on systems leadership and what works in systems leadership. Very, very recently, there's last week a substantial review on what works in terms of policy integration and coherence, whole of government approaches to delivering policy, has been published. So drawing on lessons from that literature is something we're also going to incorporate in the final report. I mean, as I've written there, lessons from its absence, by which I mean there are quite a lot of prescriptions that whole of government approaches, integrated approaches, coherent approaches are desirable, and everybody in a particular policy field or looking at a particular policy, as you might say, amen to that. But the challenge is making that happen, because if you like, effective whole of government approaches in the research literature are probably a little bit less evident than injunctions to get involved in policy integration and coherence. So what can we learn from the empirical literature about what works effectively in terms of integration of the type that we think is absolutely needed to address the housing problems that we face? And then, on a positive note, having looked at what's not happening in other countries, as much as anything, this comes from one of our correspondents. From my little knowledge of UK politics, you might have a perfect position for a government strategy for housing. You have one party, you have a government wanting to care about housing, a party understanding the problem, have an idea of how to address it with its majority, change of laws, etc. I know that housing in UK is also a thing of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but even considering this, your system is better designed to set up and follow such general strategies. Our system is the opposite, except when problems are considered extreme, but even then you might expect more quick and dirty solutions and long-term strategies. So I thought it was an interesting comment, like saying, having spent some time anatomizing the fragmented nature of the governance in that particular country and the challenges of getting people to link up and work together. It just offered a little reflection at the end, saying, from what, and this is somebody who does know UK, you might have a better chance of delivering on this than they do in that particular country. And I think that's something which I took some comfort from, and therefore I think we're potentially actually trying to do something which is genuinely novel. The English housing strategy, if it succeeds, is going to be one which is going to be wrestling with something at a level which perhaps other countries haven't yet attempted. And let's hope we can succeed in that effort. And I'll stop there, and I think I'll hand over to David.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. I think that was fascinating, and I really like the idea that we are giving to Isabel the gift of being the person who comes up with something that is unique in the world and transformational in the way that things change. No pressure. I have just a number of very kind of quick observations about the background to all of this work that Alex is talking about. As Isabel mentioned in her presentation right at the start, we put together a big coalition of different kinds of organizations, housing organizations, but also organizations who understand that their work is profoundly affected by what happens in our housing policy and delivery in the country. We had academics, we had politicians from a variety of different parts of the political system, local, central, different political parties. because the intention was to try to bring together a range of thinking, knowledge, experience and expertise to challenge the fundamental underlying problems that we all know so well. And these fundamental underlying problems, I think, can properly be characterized as a lack of strategy, a lack of coherence, and an overabundance of instant initiatives, ideas, thoughts. We'll do this week, we'll do something different next week. And for something which is so profoundly long-term in its investment, in its impact, in its implications for our health as individuals, as communities and as society collectively, we have been ill-served by that array of very, very short-term thinking about a long-term and systemic problem. And I think it is now a systemic problem. We've moved beyond the point at which we are talking about a problem where things are basically functioning, but there's bits that need a bit of fixing, to an environment where in many parts of the country there is systemic failure. And I think we should go back to the quote. I hadn't seen this quote from Alex until today, actually, from the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Affordable Housing, but that housing strategies are based on a vision of structural change that is required over time. Can we hold on to the word vision there? I think that there has been a fundamental absence of a clearly defined, nationally agreed objective underpinning everything that we do with housing and housing policy. We have had no sense of what in 5, 10, 20, 50 years good will and should look like. I know for the National Health Service that there is an overriding vision, the vision that we will be able to provide high quality care to people who need it at the point that they need it, free at the point of use. Now, no one will argue that there are no challenges in delivering that, but there is unanimity across the nation that there is that clarity of objective and that is what we're trying to achieve. What are we trying to achieve with housing? There is no similar clarity. We may think that we know we're trying to house people better. Well, let's say it. Let's say something like the ambition behind our housing strategy and the long-term goal is to ensure that everyone in our nation can be well and affordably housed in good quality, energy efficient homes in sustainable and successful neighbourhoods. I'm not going to make this up. That is a matter for government and the country. But I think we need something like that against which we can test the propositions that are coming forward. Now, this led us, after you can imagine, a very wide scale and wide-reaching conversation to some fairly straightforward propositions which Alex has already kind of indicated. The first is that to have a proper housing strategy, we need a long-term vision. You need to know the destination that you're working towards to be able to plot the course that gets you there. The strategy is the series of plans, the series of initiatives, the series of measures that will allow you to move forward and deliver against that long-term vision. And we believed in the work that we did and have said this pretty explicitly in the Homes for All paper. We believe that there does need to be a governance structure for this. There needs to be some means of testing whether initiatives that are being proposed will help us or hinder us in delivering against that long-term mission, that long-term clearly stated vision and objective. So clarity about the outcomes that we're looking for, a sense of this being long-term and something that will require continuing engagement. We think that that needs to be legislated for to make sure that it is embedded and has a much greater chance of succeeding over the long term, and with a governance structure perhaps similar to the Climate Change Committee or similar to the mechanism that Alex described for Canada, that allows an external evaluation so that we do not find ourselves in the position of initiatives being put in place which have the impact of reducing our ability to meet the long-term goals of the housing strategy. So I think that there really is an opportunity here for us collectively to support Isabel and her colleagues in MHCLG, to support a government that clearly wants to do this well, in thinking through how can we do this. And I just want to finish with two thoughts, really. The first is that it's just over 100 years since the Wheatley Act. The first really substantive piece of housing legislation that happened in the first Labour government, a minority government that lasted 9 months. We've already, I think, pretty clear evidence that this one will last longer than that. But they were able, through the Wheatley Act, to put in place a mechanism that had the support of the industry, the support of the unions, the support of a variety of different political parties, the support of the Chancellor, because they understood that it was going to be something that would improve people's living conditions, but make a very positive impact on the economy. And it lasted for several years and produced hundreds of thousands of new homes. A similar set of criteria were in place in the late 1940s and early 1950s that drove an increasing number of new homes being built over a 15-year period. We have to set our sights that high. Thank you. And I'm handing back to John, I think, to manage a Q&A.
Yes, thank you, David. Thank you, David. Thank you, Alex. Yes, so looking to questions, we've got a few questions coming in. I'm going to try and bunch these together if we can. Alex, there's one directly for you. It says, do we have any examples of specific long-term outcomes which any of the national strategies are aiming for? Alex, do you want to go answering that one?
Yes. So one of the interesting things is, in that regard, somewhere like Canada, it's affordability. It's to an extent trying to push back against a highly marketized economy. So affordability is only going to be better. Affordability is only going to be delivered by decommodified, so more affordable social housing that's of a different type than is dominant. So there's an attempt to address that. Whereas in somewhere like Japan, actually, most of the focus is on standards. I mean, there are specific things for Japan, like earthquake proof, but also some net zero decarbonization type questions. So so one of the criticisms of the Japanese strategy is it's not about affordability at all. So again, it's partial. It's addressing standards. It's not necessarily addressing affordability, or hasn't done that until recently. Whereas others, for example, in Spain, the policy orientation is towards affordability, but it's not doing anything about standards. So it's interesting keeping these things in the mix over the long term. Spain has traditionally been quite short term. They're now aiming for something a bit longer term on affordability. But again, the challenge with that is, how do you improve affordability without just leading to the deterioration of the housing stock or other important values suffering?
Thank you. Looking at the next question, we've got should we, the housing strategy, take into account other potential competing demands on land use, such as energy and other infrastructure, food production, environmental protection, etc.? The IPPR has proposed a broader spatial planning strategy, or is that overextending too far in terms of policy and policy?
Can I have first go at this?
Yeah.
I think one of the challenges in creating this housing strategy will be understanding what the limits are, because housing, as we've often argued, many of us, has such an impact on so many different things, and it doesn't sit in isolation. It sits as part of a wide system of things that relate to each other. Of course, planning relates to it, energy relates to it, education relates to it, health relates to it. So I think that the question is, what is the specific part of this where the housing component is, where in the debate is the housing component given that kind of primacy in the conversation and the discussion? And do we understand how decisions that we make there have a relationship and an impact on other parts of social and economic policy? And everyone who's thought about this at all basically says we need more coordination, and we need to separate the idea that housing is different and not part of the rest of the economy and can be looked at almost in isolation, to understanding that our homes are the things that give us a connection to the world and the confidence and security to live our lives well, which has a huge positive impact for the whole of society. So of course we have to pay attention to planning, how we do planning. But perhaps one might argue that there is a need for a similar exercise with planning, that fundamentally it's not a question of making tinkering to the planning system that we need, but a change in planning culture that is much more about thinking creatively the same thing in 20 years' time for this place. What does good look like? Define it and then put a plan in place to deliver it.
Thanks, David. Alex, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
The only thing I would add is and not to disagree with anything David just said there, but I just suddenly thought of Christine Whitehead. Then, if Christine Whitehead for LSE had been here, she would say the current stock doesn't get enough of a look in this conversation. Yeah. Most people will live their lives in houses that currently already exist, and we spend a lot of time thinking about new supply, and absolutely quite rightly, but thinking more about housing strategy towards the existing stock of dwellings is a really important part of the story. And that seems to me to be something which sometimes when we get I think housing and planning conversation is really important, but we can end up focusing on a piece of the jigsaw puzzle, and we need to try and keep the whole picture in mind.
Great, thank you. Quite a few questions coming through, so I'm just looking to see if we can consolidate some of these. Next one we've got is in the UK tends to be a focus on housing policy, on land planning reform, etc., and labour, construction, skills, etc., but capital, where the money is to come from, is neglected. Any new examples of places that have a coherent strategy on capital? Alex? Well, I mean, maybe not in the research so far, but
I was going to say not.
Saying, yeah.
But I think this not in the research so far. Although you can think of other countries which, if we get some responses from them, maybe they'll shed some light on that in terms of how they've structured finance. But I think what it does, the issue of finance has come up quite a lot, but it's come up in a slightly different way. So one of the things that has been flagged up a number of times already is the tension between something David, housing as a home versus housing as an asset versus sort of the financialization of the system. And a number of the comments we've received have been that strategies that might look good on paper don't get anywhere, or we don't even get as far as a particularly well articulated one on paper, is because that tension leads to political fracture, and therefore we can't make much progress. Should we think about right to housing as a home, put that centre, in which case a set of stakeholders maybe disengages, or if we think about it in terms of primarily finance or not necessarily only occupation, but also emphasizing institutional investment in build to rent or whatever it might be, or social housing, these sorts of things that are going on around the world, which set of interests dominates, or how can we creatively reconcile them in a way that gets us where we want to go? And a number of countries have flagged that up as a challenge that hasn't been successfully resolved.
I mean, I think this is quite a challenge because there is no shortage of money. There's plenty of money. Money will come either from the state or, you know, the public sector in one way or another, or other resources like land potentially. It is available in the private sector. It's available through equity, through debt, capital markets, all the things that we already know about. The question is, can we build a kind of architecture, a regulatory architecture for the way that money comes into the system that ensures that the legitimate expectations of people who are lending money or buying an equity share can be met without those taking supremacy over the needs of the people for whom the homes are being built and provided. And I think that's where the challenge is. We've tended to characterize this debate as financialization against. Now, I think the financialization, if you look at it purely the way some investors have them, I don't care whether anyone lives there, I don't care if the house lies empty, I just want to see a return on my investment, is disgraceful. And I think we ought to have the courage to call that out and say, in our country, we're not prepared to let that happen. But we also have to understand that if we want to meet this challenge, we need private investment. There is no way in the world that government and charity together can provide all the finance that's necessary.
That's right.
Yeah, great. Thank you, David. There's lots of questions coming in, and I'm going to have to apologise. We're running out of time to go through all of these questions. And I wanted to be able to give some time for some final remarks from Isabel. Just to hand back to Isabel on anything. There is someone has asked Isabel if you've got a time frame on the publication of the strategy, but I'll hand over to you for final remarks.
Great, thanks, Jon, and thanks so much, Alex and David, and everyone again for all of this. It's been really helpful. And Alex, I'm definitely going to grab you to grill you a bit more on some of your findings. Yeah, sorry to not be able to answer all of the questions and thoughts coming through. Partly because of where we are in the development of the strategy, but also because of the time. We will be publishing the strategy later this year, and we are really keen to hear from different people as well. Like someone I was looking at the questions asked how to get in touch. If you already have contacts in the department, this is very much I'm convening the team, which is work kind of writing the strategy and developing it with the rest of the department, but all of the rest of the department is involved. So if you already have contacts, please do use those, and it will come back. And if not, then the main department, you can contact the main kind of department correspondence email. But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much again, and I will be taking lots of these really interesting thoughts back to the team and considering them as we develop the strategy further. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Isabel. Just two final things just before we finish, just to say we will send through Alex's full report once published to everybody on the webinar today. As we said, it's already ongoing work. And the second thing is, just quickly, we are coordinating a joint letter to the Minister, Matthew Pennycook, which asks him to consider a statutory National Housing Committee based on holding governments now and in the future to account on implementing of the strategy, and also to kind of protect the legacy of the strategy as it develops. So we would be delighted if your organisations could sign up with us on that letter. And we will send round after the webinar the letter and more details. But just wanted to flag that. So please do come back to us on that. And just finally, just to say thank you for everyone for joining us today and for your support on Homes for All. And thank you once again to our speakers. And best of luck to Isabel and her team in the development of the strategy. But thank you, everyone.
Thank you.